At this point, we have our GitHub account created. We've verified it through our email address. And now we're actually ready to build our first remote repository. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and set up a project. So go ahead and click on Start a Project. And as is custom in the software development world, we're going to do a Hello World as our first repository name. It's my first repo. And I'm going to go ahead and make it public. It's my first repo. I want it part of my portfolio. I want anybody to be able to get to it. And I want anybody to be able to pull the code down. So I'm going to go ahead and keep it public. Now, README files, definitely want one of those. The README files are used to explain the purpose of the repository, describe the source code, describe what's going on in the repository. So I definitely want one of those. Git Ignore files. So let's talk about a Git Ignore file. The .git ignore file, what it does is it allows you to specify the file types that you don't want pulled up into your repository. For example, let's say I've got a JavaScript project. All of my files end with a .js. I want those in my source code. But let's say, for some reason, I also have some digital assets in there. Maybe I've got a video in there. It's an MP4. It's like a gig in size. It got in there because I was using it. It's a video, a reference to the technology I'm using. And for some reason, I copied it into my repository. And I've been watching it to update myself on some tech, and I don't want a file like that in my source code. It would take forever to commit a gig file, and really I'm just trying to protect my source. I'm not trying to protect assets or videos, images, stuff like that. So a Git Ignore provides you with an ability to ignore specific types of files. And in here, they've got a bunch of predefined Git Ignores that you can actually have created. And in there, it's going to have a bunch of common file types based on the type of project you're doing. And based on the type of project, it'll specify the files that it doesn't really want recorded or pulled up into your repository. This is useful because if you're using tools like .NET and you're using Visual Studio has a whole bunch of files, meta files, that it uses to define your project, identify where files are, record your preferences in the project that you're using through Visual Studio. And all of that stuff is specific to the Visual Studio project, not to your source code. And so a lot of people don't want to include that type of information because each developer may have a different setup or they may be using a different IDE, not necessarily Visual Studio. Therefore, they're going to want to make sure those things are excluded by Git from its file monitoring process. In other words, it's going to make sure that it doesn't acknowledge that those files exist or that they have changed and they won't be kept track of. And therefore, they won't end up inside of your remote repository, and you won't have a bunch of junk from all your developers coming up into your repository that would have to be manually removed or deleted. It also stops your repository from being bloated as time goes on. So right here, you'll see Visual Studio. If we'll go ahead and add a Visual Studio one. Licenses. You can add licenses to your repository so that when people download your code, they know exactly what they're allowed to do with that code. And there's a lot of different types of licenses or templates for licenses that you can use. Unlicensed, meaning, man, do whatever you want with the source code. MIT license is kind of a restricted, use it, but give me attribution, let people know where you got it from, stuff like that. So right now, it's just part of my portfolio. It's my first project. It's a hello world. It's not a big deal. So I'm just going to go ahead and call it unlicensed. I'm going to go ahead and create my repository. So what happens now is GitHub is going to go ahead and actually set up and create a remote Git repository on their servers. And it's now going to set up an entire repository system for me. And I can now actually begin using this repository. I can use it through this web interface that GitHub provides me through their website. This allows me to manage the repository, add users, remove users, create branches, delete branches, create releases. We can create all kinds of different things through this user interface. But the real power comes when we clone our repository to our local machine, and then we can work on stuff locally. We don't need the internet, we don't need anything. We can just sit and work on our code on our computer, and then we can upload all those changes or commit all those changes to our repository locally, and then push all of those changes up to this remote repository, and then we've got everything safe. It's redundant. We've got it in 2 different places at least until we have other developers come to our project, and then we'll have the repository replicated all over the place, and it'll be super safe. All right, so now that we've got our first repository, we're going to want to go ahead and clone it. So right now, we can choose to download a zip archive. So somebody who isn't using Git but wants to get your source, to look at it, to use it, they can download it as a zip archive, and it won't be connected to the repository. They can just use the source as is. If you want somebody to actually be able to download your source as a part of the Git repository, in other words, clone the entire Git repository to their local machine, then you're going to want to use the git clone command, and you're going to want to use this URL that's provided right here. So you're going to want to copy that to your clipboard. And then we're going to go ahead and install Git on our local machine first, so that we can then clone the repository to that machine.